Up next, I'm working on a pair of these Gibson L-30's. And this is kind of an interesting model. You don't see too much because it's a hybrid. It's got an arched top, but the backs on these are flat, or, well, relatively flat, like you would find on a typical flat top acoustic. They have the same back bracing that you'd find in an L-00 or similar guitars. They're also smaller than the usual arch tops of that period. These are 14 3/4 of an inch wide versus 16 or 17, which would be pretty common in the late 30s. They were introduced in 1935, I believe, along with the sister model, which I don't have, which is the L-37. Maybe it came out a year later, which is the same concept except it's got a round sound hole rather than these F-holes. I've never seen an L-37 in the flesh. They weren't long-lasting models. They were only around to the early 1940s. There was one other guitar that began in this style earlier in the 30s, with the arch top and flat back. That was the L-50. I think I may have a video about one of those. That model changed specs a whole lot. It was like every year it looked like a different guitar. By 1935, when they released these, they decided that the L-50 should be a standard arch top and back and a bigger size. The L-50 lasted a whole lot of years. It was, I think, probably into the early 70s. So that was a popular model. For whatever reason, I don't think these ones were big sellers. Not sure why, you know. It's a strange mix of features. Maybe for that reason, on the market, they don't bring in quite as much as their brethren. The one thing that is worrisome from a repair standpoint is the back bracing in these. I've mentioned before that Gibson back braces frequently come loose at their ends, and trying to fix those through the F-holes would be a very difficult job. A back-off kind of operation. On a regular arch top, that's not an issue because they don't generally have back braces. These are both in pretty nice shape, but I've been asked to defile them with pickups. No, I'm not going to route holes in the soundboard or anything like that. These will be acoustic top-mounted pickups, stick-ons. I will run the wires through the F-hole and drill holes in the end block for the jacks. Do I feel bad about that? No, not really. It's not an acoustically sensitive area of the guitar, and in terms of plugging and disguising them, not a huge deal. And again, these are not collector's grade L5s. You know, this is very much a working guitar. So we're going to do what the owner wants. The necks are pretty nice. They've got a fairly pronounced V shape to them, which is what Gibson was using on basically everything they were making in the second half of the 1930s. A lot of people like it. Certainly much easier to play than the L-series guitars they were making in the 1920s, which have some of the biggest necks that you're ever going to play. They are true baseball bats. Some people don't like the V shape, but you know, at least you can wrap your hands around these. These display some of the idiosyncrasies of Gibson's finishing in the later 1930s. They often have natural shaded mahogany necks, which fade into this dark color, which is all over the body. It's not sunburst on the sides, but they've kept it dark by the heel so they could get away with using a bunch of filler in there if necessary. Both of these guitars show some evidence of having had neck resets. Ebony bridges rather than rosewood. They're quite wide, kind of sculptural. Very attractive guitars. I think we frequently find mismatched woods on these, usually with mahogany sides, maple backs. Mahogany is slightly easier to bend than maple in many cases. Actually, the back on this one might be birch. The black one's very spiffy looking, quite dramatic. It's got sort of a striped ebony bridge. Again, mahogany sides. The back isn't bursted, but I can see the washboarding effect of what it turns out to be really, really highly figured maple. Solid maple. I'll see if I can show you it through the sound hole. It's really quite gorgeous. It's halfway between quilt and flame. I mean, it would not look out of place on a 59 burst. And they painted it black. The question arises, if we're going to put a jack in one of these, where's the best place to do it? think the obvious answer is where the old strap button was, but that will require enlarging the pre-existing hole in the tailpiece. Is that a huge deal? Various times I've also put them below the tailpiece or even off to the side. In this case, the original strap buttons are missing in these guitars, and in the event that someone wants to get rid of the jack in the future, like I said, popping a plug in there is not that difficult. Now, you'll never be able to replace the missing metal around it that will be reamed away. It's a trade-off, either having extra hardware in an odd location or a hole that's in the right spot but 1/8 of an inch larger than usual. In this case, I think that's okay. I'm using a simple repair reamer. Here I'm using a step bit to gradually enlarge the hole in the end block. And I'll finish off using a 31/64 bit, which usually provides a nice size for the use of these end pin jacks. Not too loose, not too tight. The tuners on the Sunburst example here are pretty awful. Some of the bushings are out of their holes and refuse to go in. We'll be replacing these. I'm going to be making some new pick guards for these, as there will need to be some cutouts to accommodate the pickups. I want to do that in vintage 1930s celluloid. We'll preserve these for future generations. Some advice for those just getting into the trade. If you have to make more than one of something, it's probably worth your time to make a template of it. Because often, a month later, another job will come along where you'll be forced to make the same part again, at which point you'll be very frustrated. As far as material goes, for the Sunburst one, got some classic tortoise. And for the black one, thought we might go a little bit crazy and do a tuxedo version with this black, white, black. Covering the intended area of the guards with masking tape because it'll be easier to draw on when I'm rough cutting the guards. I'm just checking the fidelity to the original and making sure that it's the same shape for both guitars. I'm sticking the template to the roughed out blanks using a little bit of super glue on the taped surfaces. Doesn't seem to matter where I position the vacuum hose. The swarf never really wants to go inside it. And this stuff is the very definition of static cling too, so it's likely you're going to see it appearing in future videos for months. I'll scrape a bevel onto the edges with a razor blade. On the black, white, black, the bevel also reveals the white layer, so it takes some time to get it looking consistent. It seems like I'm putting side dots in virtually every guitar I work on this year. I don't know. I never expected to have to do it in a Gibson, though. People worry about me holding the neck in a vise. This is the Parrot vise, which is a modern take on the venerable Versa vise, which was a fantastic piece of equipment. But number one, I've got jaw protectors on here that are heavily padded with cork or leather. It'll soften things. And on the front one here, the front jaw, I've planed an angle into one side, ending around the center of the jaw. And it's on the side that's toward the body of the guitar. What that does is it pivots against the jaw when I tighten it up. And it just naturally finds the angle of the neck taper. So the force is not being focused on one point on the back of the neck that, might cause a divot if I really, took it to the limit. The main thing is, this is not super tight. I'm not crushing the guitar with brutal force. It's about the same amount of pressure it takes to, hold the guitar aloft in one hand. So no need to worry. It's going to be okay. I'm going to put in the larger size dots. These are 3/32, which are associated with Gibson. I measure the locations, mark them with an awl, and then drill. I always nip off the ends a little bit to make them semi-pointed. I find it helps them to go into the hole a little more easily. It's nice, this old set of Grovers actually tells you which end is the top. The large dots are maybe a little bit more difficult to trim this way because you have more of a radius to contend with. They take up more space on the curve, so you can't just come across them flat. You've got to sort of cut that curve into them. Number of ways of doing that. You can also use the razor blade kind of like a draw knife. That works okay too. If these are too glaringly white, I can use a little bit of touch-up marker, sort of a yellowy amber tone to kind of knock it down a little bit. Although this player, I think, wants me to try using some of that glow-in-the-dark paint as well. Okay, for amplification, the first one we've got a Barkus Berry high-tech pickup, which I suspect has been around for a good many years. This model has this really bizarre belt clip on the back of it, which is actually integral with the back plate. I'm going to have to cut that loose. And I should probably test it to make sure it's functional. Okay, the output is 5.3. Interesting. Got this taped up so that there's not going to be any chance of particles getting inside the pickup. And I'm using my jeweler's saw here. You're going to simulate the position here. I've been asked to move it as far forward towards the neck as possible without it fretting out. So I'll simulate that with a straight edge on the last fret and resting on the bridge. I want there to be enough clearance that there's no chance if you were to actually fret that note that it would hit the top of the pickup. I also have to remember that there's going to be a couple of layers of self-adhesive tape on there because this is a rounded surface and a flat bottom pickup, right? So there's a tendency for it to rock and have to build up enough that it's going to remain stuck. And this is also the time that I'll discover that the current lead wire on this is probably, yeah, it's just about 1 inch too short to make it to the hole in the tailpiece. That's infuriating. I'm going to graft on 1 inch of wire, but that's always the way. Got to plot the position pretty accurately. This is a very old finish, of course, and I'm sticking this tape to my shirt a couple of times to pick up enough lint that I'll be able to take it off again. And I'm going to be very delicate. I don't want to be, rubbing that too hard because otherwise the finish is going to come right up with the tape. That would be bad. And yes, there are things like sign maker's tape that have low tack. However, I find this always works. Haven't found a need to purchase that stuff yet. I'll run the ruler against the edge of the fretboard on both sides. It's difficult with an instrument with such an undulating top. Well, that should let me plot a center line so that I can put the pickup there and it's going to remain on the center line. And that seems to match up pretty well with the edge of the pick guard. I put some tape on the pickup and marked center on it. You can see because of the angle of the fingerboard, which is going to hold the pick guard at that same angle, the cutout in the pick guard is going to have to be slightly tapered as well, from 5.5 millimeters on this side to 4. I've also got the greatest extent for this little tab that's on here as well. Now, there are a lot of guitars out there which have had their pick guards discarded over the years because, well, I don't need it, by people who don't really recognize how much effort goes into trying to replicate one of them. They're not a quick little thing, right? There's a lot of work that goes into this. I kind of hope that the outside radius of these will be about 1/2 inch, exactly, which it is, which was smart. I'll wire up the barrel jack. I've stuck some cork to the pickup. I'm using some double stick adhesive on the cork, which will be used to stick it to the guitar. I fed the plug portion of an input cable attached to a wire through the end pin hole, pulled it out through the F-hole, and this lets me pull the jack into place. Now I need to feed the nut and the washer on there and tighten them up. Now with the pick guard back on, I feel confident in sticking this down. Can I just take a second and say I think it's aesthetically egregious when a company goes out of its way to advertise their own product on the face of it. You know, who wants 80s typography blaring at them like this from an aftermarket device on a 1930s guitar, no less? You know, I would paint this black. These are some of Alfie's guitars, so I have to put strap buttons on them through the side of the instrument, not into the heel, because he doesn't like that. So I have to make some interior support blocks to absorb the screw and spread its leverage or its pressure over a wider area of the side so it won't crack. I like to make them into little pyramids. Okay, I pulled out some of my orphaned strings here, you know, from the times when you have to open a pack to get one single G string that broke during tuning that you don't have a spare for. And this is how I feed the support block into the guitar. I take something like a B string in this case and I fold it over so that it's bent over on itself, and I'll do something similar to a string that has been threaded through the support block. This is all kind of complicated by the fact that I'm working in an F-hole guitar, and these two are going to like mate with each other. You'll see. I'll also get some thread and tie that onto the ball end of the string, which will be holding this support block in place so that I can retrieve the string from the inside of the guitar without too much of a hassle. Okay, so capture string goes through the hole. Capture string is mated with the clamping string. A piece of tape helps things go through the hole more cleanly. Okay. Capture string can be saved for the next guitar. I'll put some glue on the support. It's good to think about the dimensions of these things so that you can actually get them inside the guitar, just barely. Now I can use the thread tied onto the string to control it until I reach the side of the guitar. I'll just wind it up with my guitar tuner clamp. Okay, the black guitar is getting one of these Crevo Micro Stealth PAF humbuckers, which is in a case that is apparently ebony, but I don't think it is. I think it's ebonized. It's this brownish blackish color, which is nice because it kind of matches the bridge. This guitar has a fairly wide fingerboard, pretty normal spacing, like 2 3/16 of an inch, like 53.5 millimeters at the saddle. I'm going to push the string band closer towards the treble side because this player plays slide, and it's nice if your high string is closer to the edge of the board for that. And yeah, it'll do fine. The spacing here on the humbucker is just about perfect, actually, where it ended up. Theoretically, you could have a much wider string spacing if you were willing to make a new saddle top and not use this pickup. Yeah, so now I just got to peel and stick. Here's why the thread was put on there. These can be hard to retrieve otherwise. You certainly don't want to skimp on hole size when drilling pilots for strap buttons, especially in a case like this, where it goes through the side. You want a clearance hole that's the same diameter as the screw, or maybe just a hair larger. The hole in the block should be the root diameter of the screw threads. Shouldn't take excessive torque to put the screw in. It's a nice, proper fit. Trying to wipe off some fingerprints here before wrapping these things up. Black guitars and white guitars show everything. It all gets thrown into high relief. These are a different animal with the flat back. These seem quieter than their standard archtop brethren. I almost think the concept works better in reverse, to be honest. Like a flat top and an arched back. I've played a number of guitars built that way. These amplify well. I'm pretty impressed with both these pickups I put in here. And I kind of want to play them plugged in more than unamplified, which is something I did not expect. You know, they don't feel like big band chop rhythm chord guitars either. There's a kind of lyricism in them when they're plugged in. I'm wondering whether this has to do with some things. I remember seeing Ken Parker do a talk about Gibson's design ethics and how it changed in the mid-30s. If you look at the 1920s guitars from Lloyd Loar onwards, they were pretty fastidious, kind of Italian violin tradition, where they were fitting the braces to the undulating surface of the top with a high degree of precision. But by the mid-30s, they were doing things like they'd put the brace in there and they would cut a couple of kerfs almost all the way through it so it could force down into the top, and they wouldn't have to spend all day, you know, going back and forth chalk fitting it. Then they'd glue a piece of veneer over top, which is a very different way of constructing things, you know. So unamplified, they're less exciting than the 1920s guitars, the L1's and L3's I've worked on from 10 years previous. But it's an interesting part of the history, and glad I had a chance to work on these.